topic here by Richard Wolff, Professor Richard Wolff. I believe he has a PhD in economics, right? So pretty knowledgeable as far as different economic systems and theories goes. Pretty good source for the most part, at least from a lot of the things I've heard him talk about. And in this one, the Ask Prof. Wolff segment, he's being asked by, he says, Patreon supporter, what is socialism with Chinese characteristics? So it'll be kind of interesting to see what he describes here in that, because I kind of have my own perspective, and we'll see if it matches, then discuss.
Prof. Wolff question sent in by our Patreon community, and in this case by a member of that community, Jordan. Jordan asks an interesting question about China, and in particular about the way the Chinese like to describe their system. Quote, socialism with Chinese characteristics. And Jordan asks me to go into what that means, what that is, how it differs from other kinds of socialism with other characteristics other than Chinese. To explain this, you need to go back and know something about China, and particularly about China's relationship to what was, at the time the Chinese made their revolution, back
49,
in
right?
1949,
Yep. Bam. I got it.
when they completed a civil war, basically, a war that they won to establish modern communism in China, as it was then called. I should be careful to explain that using the word communism is itself problematic. The Chinese, like the Russians, have always referred to the Soviet Union and to the People's Republic of China
communist
as quote-unquote socialist societies. Communism was the name of their political party that was in power.
Because, again, what socialism is the lower form of communism, communism being a classless and stateless society, and in the meantime, you know, this lower form, this socialist form, would be a dictatorship of the proletariat.
Not the name of their system. Communism was something that
they're working towards.
The
exactly.
The role of the Communist Party
was to get it there.
Was to establish socialism,
yep.
and then to guide that socialism
to communism,
to another stage, another system called communism. People lose sight of that.
On point so far.
Because what the Russians had until 1989 in the Soviet Union, and what the Chinese communists, in that's
is
the way they call
socialism.
It, party, what they had in China to this day is socialism, not, or at least not yet, communism.
Yeah, good.
Let's go back. Socialism
with Chinese characteristics.
Well, the great model for China in 1949, when they began
probably the USSR,
to
right?
construct Chinese socialism, having won the Civil War in China at that time, the big model for them was the Soviet Union,
yep.
which had helped them to make their revolution, helped them win the Civil War, helped them in countless ways. But the Chinese knew that their culture, their history was different from that of Russia.
So they had to give it their own version of it.
Have some important differences. Well, it didn't take long. Literally 11 years. Between 1949,
1960,
when the Mao Zedong government took over in China, and 1960, a mere 11 years, that was enough. In 1960, basically, Russia and China broke off their solidarity and their friendly relationships and became quite critical of one another at various kinds of intensity. The Chinese wanted to go in different directions. They had already done that in the 1950s by trying to set up communes on a mass social scale. Communes are a step towards that communism. Russia had not done anything like what the Chinese did. The Chinese didn't stay with it very long. By 1960, it was already in decline. But it was already a hint that the Chinese would go their own way. Well, to make a long history short and condensed, what the Chinese did different from Russia, the most important two things were: one, they did not insist on keeping their economy a totally government-owned and operated
They
economy.
made some room for the
They just
private
didn't do
sector,
it.
right?
Partly the reason the Soviets did it was forced on them. The rest of the world treated them as a pariah. But the treatment of China wasn't all that different. But the Chinese made a strategic decision over the last 50 years. They were going to open their economy to allow private enterprise, organized and started and run by Chinese citizens, but also, particularly after the 1980s, to allow foreign private capitalist enterprises, Japanese, European, American, to establish private enterprises. The Chinese government would retain final power and authority.
Mm-hmm.
The Chinese Communist Party would be the dominant, exclusive owner of political power over both the private and the government sectors. The government kept some industry under its own control. It is a highly organized, top-down economic system, but it allows private enterprise on a scale never seen by the Soviet Union. So one thing that's unique about Chinese socialism is its allowance for a very large private capitalist sector. The second thing that distinguishes the Chinese brand of socialism was a reliance on exports. Most revolutions by socialists involved taking over governments, reorganizing societies that were inward-looking, that were not focused on exports, largely because the rest of the world didn't want to help these countries succeed, wanted in a way to choke them, and so would not buy the products they had to sell, so they had to turn in on themselves and kind of make it without being part of the world economy. That meant an enormous reliance on the few other countries that would trade with them, like Russia, Soviet Russia, and so on. You can see the difference because, like Russia, Vietnam, Cuba, and other countries that went in that direction became self-sufficient to an extraordinary degree and or reliant on the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The Chinese would not do that. They became focused on international trade with everybody. You might say that the strategy of socialism in China was to become the manufacturing center for the whole world.
Which they've done a good
Build
job.
a socialism with a reliance on exports, something that other socialists probably couldn't have done if they had wanted to, but ended up really not wanting to, in the sense of not trying very hard to go in that direction. So China became very unique in its kind of socialism, its opening to allow the coexistence of private capitalism in big, major parts of the economy, and in its engagement with the world economy, both of those things giving China a much greater grasp of the rest of the world, a more integrated understanding of the rest of the world because of the constant back and forth interactions between China and the rest of the world, whereas Soviet Russia, Vietnam, Cuba, and so on were heavily cut off from the rest of the world. I think those are the basic qualities, and it makes the Chinese different from the North Koreans and from many others, including their model, the Soviet Union. The interesting thing was that those two strategic decisions of the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party to allow private enterprise to coexist and to be engaged in international trade, those two things proved in the last decades of the 20th century to give China an opportunity to achieve even more rapid economic development than Russia had achieved during its Soviet period.
It's impressive.
Making Russia and China the two fastest growing global economies. Russia in the 20th century and China
21st.
in the 21st.
I mean, yeah, I think you make some good points there, and look what they've been able to accomplish in China with socialism with Chinese characteristics. I mean, look how they've handled the pandemic compared to the United States. They eliminated extreme poverty this year. Their infrastructure is night and day ahead of the United States. And again, they opened up their country to these both foreign and domestic kind of capitalist interests, but the government and then the ruling party, the Chinese Communist Party, makes all of these decisions. It's still a planned economy, and look what they've been able to achieve as a result. And then let's get Bay Area 415's perspective, see if it matches up with Richard Wolff's. Got Mao up there. Comrade report.
What do you think, comrades? Huh? I got a little inspired. But enough said. Let's dive into this video. If there is one thing that I want you to remember, comrades, it's this.
Capitalism's bad.
Markets are
Not capitalism.
Capitalism is not. Markets, under the supervision and regulation
CPC,
of a
right?
disciplined Communist Party, can effectively generate the necessary productive forces,
Which they
for a
clearly
socialist
have.
country.
Productive forces, socialism, communism, and what's this about a dictatorship?
Comrades, I wish it would be as simple as to just flash a definition for socialism with Chinese characteristics on screen right now and just be done with the video. But there is just so much we need to learn from China, especially considering its history and economic might it enjoys today. It is incredibly important to understand socialism in China for all leftists around the world, even those that disagree with them. I read this entire
Need to get that
front
book.
to back ever since I got it. This was a publication from one of the most astute professors
Need to take a
of
picture of
Marxism
that.
in China, and it was approved by the CPC themselves. Why did I do this? Because I wanted to hunker down a true definition of what socialism with Chinese characteristics
Take a
is
picture?
dialectically for you, comrades.
Not
This textbook
really.
was published back in 2017 in English. However, its original copyright states that this was published back in 2011 under President Hu Jintao, right before Xi Jinping. So take that into account as well. Also, I am unfortunately not a professor or an academic expert in Marxism. Sure, I dedicated large amounts of time reading Marxist theory and publishing dozens of essays about communism in China, but I do not have any certificates or degrees on the subject. So, if I misinterpret or get something 100% completely wrong in good faith by a Marxist-Leninist, please comment below or let me know on my Twitter or Reddit, and I'll be happy to address them, possibly in a second video. With all this said, I'm going to structure this video in very simple terms, going in depth into some areas while speed running other areas. We can literally spend hours on each topic I'm going to go over here, but I want to explain socialism with Chinese characteristics in 30 minutes or less, starting now. You cannot understand socialism with Chinese characteristics without understanding the following 9 terms: dialectical materialism, historical materialism, productive forces, relations of production, capitalism, communism, socialism, scientific socialism, and 9, the dictatorship of the proletariat. When it comes to the first 2 definitions, Comrade Luna Oy did a fantastic job in diving into these definitions and basically summarized the first chapter or 2 from this textbook in her video here. However, as she took over 40 minutes on these topics, I'm going to spend about 30 seconds using her definitions. So, here we go. Dialectics is trying to find the truth by arguing different sides. Materialism is the approach that it is possible to measure, observe, and understand
Material world.
everything in our physical world through scientific methods. Marx and Engels refined them both to create
Dialectical
theory,
materialism.
which is the understanding of the world by forming arguments based on evidence from our material realities using scientific methods. Historical materialism is simply dialectical materialism being applied to history. History evolves through circumstances of which people pursue such changes, and that momentous shifts in history are interconnected with material conditions of the people at that time, either politically, socially, economically, what have you. It's not done by a singular leader or idea. Moving on to production. Production is basically how we as a people produce the things that we need. Productive forces are the methods and tools we use to produce material goods. This ranges from a miner using a pickaxe to mine ore, to factory workers using machines to refine that ore into gold. Relations of production is how a society organizes and manages people and production, aka how labor is used, who benefits from what
Capitalists
production,
in the
who
US,
owns
that's
what,
for sure.
etc. Understanding production is incredibly important for Marxism because it shows how we make the stuff we need to survive and who benefits from that creation.
Not the workers,
Marxism
yeah.
claims that those that have power over how this stuff is made, as well as the process of efficiently obtaining these materials we need to survive, does not necessitate exploitation. From here, we can define capitalism as a social system based on private ownership of the means of production and the exploitation of
That's
hired
definitely what we
labor.
have in the US, right?
Communism is a stateless, classless, moneyless
Socialism, that intermediate stage.
society. In fact, communism can be summarized in one sentence according to the
Classless
Communist
and
Manifesto:
stateless society, right?
the abolition of private property. Socialism is the transitional period
Dictatorship
between
of
the overthrow of
proletariat,
capitalism
yeah.
and communism, in which the means of
Ooh,
production
well, I'm
are
yawning so
publicly
much.
owned by the people under the dictatorship of the proletariat. Scientific socialism, as opposed to utopian socialism, uses dialectical and historical materialism to analyze the contradictions of production and value under
Socialism
capitalism
will win, it has
and
to,
arrives
right?
to the inevitable
Or I'll be
conclusion
dead.
that socialism will win. However, Marx said that his theory is not dogma or worship, but just a method of observation. The application of Marx's theory must depend on specific times, places, and conditions. But the key words I hope everyone understands about socialism is transition and circumstances. Even Engels said private property cannot be abolished by one stroke. He says, quote, "In all probability, the proletariat revolution will transform existing society gradually and will become able to abolish private property only when the means of production are available in sufficient quantity." Marx concluded, and current socialist countries have proven that societies are able to skip over capitalist modes of production and political systems, but they cannot skip over the high development of productivity associated with capitalism to provide for their people and fend off reactionaries. Marx also observed that the working class cannot simply lay hold of ready-made machinery and wield it for its own purposes.
Gotta destroy it,
The
right?
failure of the Paris Commune, according to Marx, was due to a lack of centralization and authority. This is where the dictatorship of the proletariat comes in, which is the governing power representing the proletariat through the state after the overthrow of capitalism that oversees the transition of socialism by managing the means of production through promoting public ownership and generating productive forces while stamping out reactionaries and capitalistic influences. The importance of understanding all these definitions gives us the conclusion that capitalism and the bourgeois class it creates are exploitative of the people. However, changing the ownership of production to the hands of the people while efficiently providing for the people the material resources
Okay,
they
everybody
need to
likes it.
survive without exploitation is what scientific socialism is all about, and what socialism, with Chinese characteristics, attempts to achieve. Once we understand these definitions, we can now turn to Lenin, Stalin, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR.
USSR.
This is extremely important to understand for socialism with Chinese characteristics, as the USSR was the first country in the world to overthrow capitalism and provide a framework to practice socialism. Vladimir Lenin, a hallmark figure of the Russian Revolution, contributed so much to understanding the roles of the state.
State and Revolution is a great book by Lenin.
Read State and Revolution. He states as quoted, in any socialist revolution, after the proletariat seizes power and basically finishes the task of depriving exploitators and suppressing their revolt, it is bound to give the priority to the fundamental task of creating a social structure higher than that of the capitalist and improving labor productivity. However, this could not be done through communes, federations, or even jumping into communistic policies, as the productive forces in Russia were nowhere near
Had to
what they
build
needed
them
to
up,
be
right?
to efficiently provide for the people while fending off counter-revolutionaries that were coming at them in droves. This is where we get to New Economic Policy, or NEPT. NEPT was basically state capitalistic measures taken to increase the productive forces of Russia during their transition from capitalism to socialism. The theoretical significance of NEPT is that it provides an economic model for countries dominated by small class production to transition into socialism. Thought to be a retreat, many of the left criticize this. But as we see how important production is for a stable socialist system, Lenin pushed for NEPT by stating the following: state capitalism would be a step forward as compared with the present state of affairs in our Soviet Republic. I can imagine what noble indignation some people will recoil from these words. What? The transition of state capitalism in the Soviet Socialist Republics would be a step forward? Isn't this a betrayal of socialism? We must deal with this point in greater detail. Lenin continues, our state capitalism differs essentially from the state capitalism in countries that have bourgeois governance, in that the state with us is represented not by the bourgeoisie,
But by the
but
working
by the
class.
proletariats who have succeeded in winning the full confidence of the peasantry. On the contrary, the development of capitalism controlled and regulated by the proletariat state, i.e. state capitalism in this sense of the term, is
That makes sense,
advantageous
right?
and necessary in an extremely devastated and backward small peasant country. After the economy recovered through NEPT, Stalin took power and initiated his model for the economy, which include, number one, a highly centralized planned economy through governmental and political means, two, collectivized farming, and three, the
Kulaks,
banning of
them damn
private and commercial
kulaks.
industries. By the time the Stalin model was installed, the USSR was the most powerful country in Europe and the second most powerful country
In the world.
in less than 2 decades.
That is
This
impressive.
Stalin model for socialist economies became the main planned economy model for building socialism. However, after World War II and Stalin's death, there were difficult economic periods of stagnation and constant reform to keep up productivity, along with the liberalization efforts and de-Stalinization efforts from Soviet leaders. And as China soon found out, an unyielding adherence to the Stalin model was not working out.
Don't want to
for
be
them.
dogmatic, like Marx said.
Before I get into this chapter, I want to say this Marx quote, as it perfectly summarizes China's conditions and pathways towards socialism with Chinese characteristics. Marx said, quote, no social order is ever destroyed before all the productive forces for which it is sufficient have been developed, and new superior relations of production never replace older ones
Shit, Marx,
before the
dude, what a
material
little badass.
conditions for their existence have matured within
That
the
beard,
framework of
thinks
the old
he's
society. So long as it is not
Engels.
possible to produce so much that there is enough for all, with more left over for expanding social capital and extending the forces of production, there must always be a ruling class directing the use of society's productive forces and a poor oppressed class. Jumping into Mao now. Mao was a great revolutionary leader that broke many precedents with Marxist theory set by the USSR while following Marxist-Leninist ideology for China to arrive at the success it is today. He unified the necessary classes and nationalistic interests in overthrowing capitalism. He commenced an industrialization process under his new democracy initiatives to transition into socialism, and finally he pursued Marxism in every step in addressing China's social, economic, and political issues. It is because of his revolutionary achievements that the CPC continues to uphold Mao Zedong thought, and many members of the CPC consider themselves Maoists. However, there were some serious drawbacks that some of Mao's initiatives had, some of which are considered, quote, mistakes by the CPC. The textbook doesn't really go into these mistakes, but they do label them as such. By following more centralized models of the USSR while neglecting economic development to prepare for a war with other capitalist powers that never came to be, the economy stagnated, with incremental increases in GDP and productivity. Things like the Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, and the Gang of Four fiasco were all signs that an overcommitment to socialistic ideals, while the productive forces were nowhere near ready.
So they had to build up the production forces,
due to
right?
their material conditions, were damaging the people. I want to add here as well why China's commitment to scientific socialism is incredible. They were able to analyze the material realities of their situation. By the 1980s, productive forces were not maximized as they had a population of over 900 million people, 80% of which were still peasants. They were able to critique their own founder and call out these mistakes. They were not dogmatically or arbitrarily following Mao while ignoring their material conditions. They adopted and still upheld the thoughts and contributions of Mao while shifting towards a better transitional system. Deng Xiaoping said it best when he said, quote, "It's true that Mao made mistakes in a certain period, but he was after all a principal founder of the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China. In evaluating his merits and mistakes, we hold that his mistakes were only secondary. What he
Look
did
at that,
for the Chinese people can
learning
never
from
be
Mao,
erased.
proven
In our
upon him.
hearts,
That's awesome.
we Chinese will always
Don't be
cherish
dogmatic, that's
as
for
the
sure.
founder of our party and our
Always
state.
examine the material conditions that are
China's
there.
conditions were different from that of the Soviet Union and needed to blaze a new path forward in order to survive. A shift in focus to China's productive forces and economic development was needed, which leads us into
Deng Xiaoping theory.
Deng Xiaoping stated, "The essence of socialism is liberation and development of productive forces, elimination of exploitation and polarization, and the ultimate achievement for prosperity for all." The first step in moving towards their famous opening up and reform was admitting that they are still in the primary
Underdeveloped.
stages of socialism and will remain there for a long time. Productivity was not high enough to usher in a transition towards socialism. They must keep building their productive
In order to
forces
meet the needs
through
of the
more
people, right?
investment within and outside the country. With the need for China to dramatically increase its productive forces, the CPC and Deng Xiaoping were going against the Stalin model of planned economies to address their own conditions for the first time and discovering that one of the tools that can help them rapidly produce their productive forces was markets. The establishment of the socialist market economy in China is a breakthrough in traditional socialist theory
Closed
and
economies,
a
right?
subversion in modern Western economics that equated markets
With capitalism.
Here is the textbook definition of what a market economy is. A market economy is an economic system in which prices, salary, and the supply of goods are controlled by what and how much people buy, not by the government, applied in both private-owned capitalist economy and a public-owned socialist economy. Price is set by producers of consumers, and the owners of the means of production, and a market economy is subordinate to the basic social system that can serve both capitalism and socialism. Both the Anglo-Saxon or the United States and UK model and the Rhine model, the European markets, limit state intervention, emphasize individualism, and relies on a capitalistic foundations for their markets to function. China's socialist market model emphasizes the following. 1. The market is subordinate, restricted, and dependent on the basic socialist system. 2. Dominance of public ownership, which still holds true today in China. 3. The principle of distribution according to work. And 4. The promotion of the goal of common prosperity and that people are masters of their country. This is different from capitalist market economies, which maximizes profit along with exploiting labor power
as much as
to the
possible.
maximum possible extent.
Get the Dorito workers on strike right now.
Polarization between rich and poor. We're obviously seeing that today, folks. Also within private ownership of the means of production, the capitalist system is safeguarding the interests of the bourgeoisie. The working class, without the means of production, has to engage in wage labor subject to exploitation and oppression. The socialist system establishes an equal status of the working people as masters of their country. A socialist market is based on public ownership of the means of production,
and the needs of the
which
people.
makes common prosperity as
Easier.
the main objective. In a socialist market economy, the purpose of production is to
meet the social needs. Yes. Not to create a profit for the capitalists. Yes.
This model gave Deng Xiaoping the confidence to say the following. No matter what degree we open up to the outside world and admit foreign capital, its relative magnitude will be small and cannot affect our system of socialist public
complementary role to our effort to develop,
capital and technology, and even allowing foreigners to construct plants in China can only play a complementary role in our effort to develop the productive forces.
It's been proven. That's been proven true, you know.
Bring some decadent capitalist influences into China, and we are aware of this possibility. It is nothing to be afraid of. Why in the world is China not afraid of capitalist influences?
It's the control of the CPC,
because of the
right?
Dictatorship of the proletariat.
Yes.
Or in China, the People's Democratic Dictatorship. Market economies are opposite of common prosperity and are more akin to serving individual private interests. However, the CPC's duty is to redistribute wealth to narrow such gap and eliminate contradictions through taxation,
There's Xi
social
Jinping, right?
relief, security policies, and other measures to ensure the well-being of workers and achieve common prosperity. But they must do more than this as well. Markets promote other ideologies that harm and corrode Marxism. Bourgeois liberalism, money worship, economic privatization, neoliberalism. Through the CPC's leadership, all these paper tigers were defeated, especially considering the 2008 financial crisis and the corona pandemic. How can the CPC be so ideologically disciplined? Deng Xiaoping's four cardinal principles. The principle of upholding the socialist path, the principle of upholding the People's Democratic Dictatorship, the principle of upholding the leadership of the Communist
CPC,
Party
baby.
of China, and the principle of upholding Mao Zedong thought and Marxist-Leninism. These are the non-debatable tenets of socialism
With Chinese characteristics.
Reflecting on scientific socialism, these principles were
Alright, you guys can watch more down below. I'll link this video since we didn't go through all of it, but pretty interesting. What are your thoughts, y'all's thoughts on characterism with Chinese, or socialism with Chinese characteristics, I should say. I mean, frankly, it makes a lot of sense to me, and just look what China has been able to accomplish and what they continue to accomplish. Again, like, the infrastructure there is night and day ahead of the United States, and they're extending it to basically, it seems like every region and every part of the country. They eliminated extreme poverty earlier this year. Look at how they handled the pandemic compared to the United States. Seems like it's working really, really well. And again, I would much rather live in a country like China than the United States, this capitalist shithole that I'm currently living in, and hopefully will be visiting China next summer maybe. So if you have any spots, leave them down below where I should check out if we travel to China next year. Peace, much love. Like the video if you like the damn video. Subscribe for more content.